Sometimes the cruelest thing in a room isn't what people say out loud. It's what everyone is willing to laugh at. On a cold Friday night in downtown Boston, the kind of night when the sidewalks shine from a recent drizzle and every restaurant window looked warmer than the street outside, Ethan Whitmore arrived at Marlowe House exactly 7 minutes early for a blind date he already regretted agreeing to. The hostess smiled too brightly when she saw the wheelchair, then glanced down at her reservation tablet as if she needed to double-check that a man like him could possibly belong in a place like this. Ethan noticed because he always noticed. He had gotten very good at reading the half-second change in people's faces, the flicker of pity, the awkward recalculation, the quiet disappointment when they realized the handsome stranger in the tailored charcoal coat wasn't going to stand up and shake their hand. Still, he gave his name in a calm voice, adjusted the cuff of his shirt, and rolled toward the table by the windows where his date was already waiting with a glass of white wine and the bored expression of someone who believed the night had better impress her quickly. Her name was Vanessa Cole. Her profile photo had promised elegant, warm, funny. In person, she was elegant, yes, but warmth was nowhere to be found. She looked Ethan over once, slowly, from his neatly combed dark hair to the silver watch at his wrist to the black wheels beneath the table, and her smile thinned so sharply it almost made a sound. "Wow," she said, leaning back in her chair. They really left that part out. Ethan rested his hands lightly on the rims of his chair. "Good evening to you too." Vanessa let out a small laugh, not because anything was funny, but because she liked the audience of nearby tables pretending not to listen. "I'm sorry," she said, though she clearly wasn't. "I just don't do surprises like this." Ethan had heard versions of it before. Not always this blunt. Sometimes it came wrapped in fake concern, or spiritual language, or claims about chemistry. But underneath, it was always the same message. "You would have been acceptable if I had known what I was getting into." He could have turned around and left. He should have. But pride can make a person sit through things dignity would never approve of. So he stayed still, his expression composed, while Vanessa picked up her phone and tilted it just enough for him to know exactly what she was doing. She wasn't checking a message. She was taking a picture. Then she smirked at the screen and typed something with fast, delighted thumbs. A second later, the phone on the table buzzed with replies, and Vanessa laughed again, this time louder. "My friends are losing it," she said. "No one told me my date would come with wheels." The words landed softly, but the silence around them landed harder. A man at the next table looked down at his steak. A woman near the bar took a sip of water and stared straight ahead. No one interrupted. No one said a thing. Ethan felt that old, familiar heat crawl up the back of his neck. Not rage, not exactly, but the exhaustion that came when humiliation arrived dressed as entertainment. He reached for his wallet, ready to end it, when a clear voice cut through the room before he could speak. "Ma'am," the voice said, steady and polite, "this guest is under our personal care tonight." Ethan turned. The waitress standing beside the table looked no older than her late 20s, with chestnut blonde hair pinned back neatly, a black apron tied at her waist, and the kind of calm face that made chaos seem embarrassed to continue in front of her. In one hand, she held a water carafe. In the other, a small ivory card with a single word printed across it in gold script. Reserved. Without asking permission, she set that card gently on Ethan's table as if it had always belonged there. Then she looked at Vanessa, not angry, not flustered, just firm enough to make cruelty feel cheap. "Sir," she said, turning to Ethan with quiet respect, "your private table is ready." And somehow, with one graceful lie and one simple gesture, she changed everything. Claire Bennett did not wait for Ethan to answer, and that was what made the rescue feel real. She moved with the calm efficiency of someone who had spent years carrying trays through crowded aisles and knew that hesitation invited disaster. She lifted the water carafe slightly, gave Ethan the faintest nod, and stepped aside just enough to create a clear path away from the table, away from the phone still glowing in Vanessa's hand, away from the silence of strangers who were relieved that someone else had decided to do the decent thing for them. Ethan looked at the reserve card, now resting beside his untouched bread plate, then back at Claire. For one suspended second, He almost refused. Pride again. Pride had a way of making even kindness feel dangerous. But then Vanessa gave a little shrug, as if she had already moved on to the next amusing thing in her night. And that was enough. Ethan placed both hands on the wheels and turned his chair with controlled precision. "Lead the way," he said. Claire did not glance back at Vanessa. She did not apologize for interrupting the date, did not smooth the moment over, did not perform for the room. She simply guided Ethan past the polished bar, through a narrow hallway lined with framed black and white photos of old Boston, and out to a tucked-away courtyard that glowed beneath strings of warm lights. The rain had stopped, but the air still smelled clean, like wet brick and rosemary from the herb boxes near the railing. In the center of the courtyard sat a small round table with no place setting on it, just a candle in a glass hurricane and the soft hush of the city beyond the walls. Claire set the water carafe down and pulled out a chair across from the empty space where Ethan could roll in comfortably. "I am sorry," she said at last. And now that they were alone, her voice had lost the polished restaurant brightness and become something quieter, more human. "Not for moving you. For what happened in there?" Ethan let out a breath that felt older than the evening. "You do not work for her." "No," Claire said, "but I work in a room that let it happen." That answer made him look at her properly for the first time. She was not trying to win points. She was not using soft pity or over-careful language. She had the composed face of someone who understood humiliation from the inside, even if its details have been different. Claire reached into the pocket of her apron and placed a menu on the table, though they both knew he had not come out there to order. "You can stay as long as you want," she said, "or 5 minutes, or 30 seconds. Whatever helps you leave with your dignity instead of her version of the story." A small, humorless smile touched Ethan's mouth. "That line sounds rehearsed." Claire smiled back just barely. "It is not. I just hate bullies." Somewhere inside the restaurant, a burst of laughter rose and faded. Ethan glanced toward the doorway, then down at his watch, an elegant silver piece with a hairline crack running across the face. Claire noticed the fracture, but was polite enough not to ask. Most people noticed the chair first and stopped there. Ethan had become so accustomed to that order of observation that he almost missed what had just happened. Claire had looked him in the eye from the beginning. "Would you like me to bring you something?" she asked. "Coffee, dessert, a better date." That pulled a real laugh from him, brief but honest. "Do you keep those in the kitchen?" "Only on weekends," she said. Then her expression softened again. "Tea, maybe. It is cold out here." Ethan nodded once. "Tea would be good. Chamomile or Earl Grey?" "Earl Grey. That feels right," she said, as if she had filed away a clue about him she might need later. Before leaving, she adjusted the candle so it sat farther from the edge of the table, then placed a folded linen napkin beside his hand. The gesture was so ordinary it should not have mattered. But it did. She had seen that his date had not only mocked him, she had left him in a room full of witnesses without even the courtesy of pretending he belonged. Claire had answered that insult not with a grand speech, but with a private table, a steady voice, and a clean white napkin laid down like dignity could still be restored one simple object at a time. When she returned a minute later with a steaming cup and a small dish of honey, she also carried the ivory reserve card. "You forgot." "This," she said. Ethan looked up. It was not real. Claire set it gently beside the saucer. "It is now." He stared at the card for a moment, at the gold script catching the candlelight, and something in his chest shifted that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with relief. In a world that had become very skilled at reducing people to their worst day, their injury, their weakness, their inconvenience, a waitress he had never met had just rewritten the scene without asking for anything in return. Claire stepped back, giving him space again, but Ethan stopped her before she could turn away. "What is your name?" She met his gaze. "Claire Bennett." He repeated it once, quietly, as though it belonged in memory already. "Thank you, Claire." She gave a small nod. "You are welcome, Mr. Whitmore." Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. "You know who I am?" Claire glanced toward the restaurant, then back at him. "I know your name from the reservation list," she said. That is all. But the truth was, from the moment she had seen the way he carried humiliation without letting it bend his spine, she had known one thing that mattered far more than whatever name was attached to the booking. He was a man who had been forced to become stronger than he ever should have needed to be. And for the first time that night, Ethan did not feel looked at. He felt seen. Claire returned to the dining room, but the night no longer felt like an ordinary shift. Plates still clinked. Glasses still caught the amber light. Orders still moved in and out of the kitchen on practice timing. Yet something in the room had changed for her, as if the air itself had been divided into before and after. Before, it had been another Friday at Marlowe House, another expensive evening full of polished manners and private cruelty. After, there was a man in the courtyard with a cracked silver watch, a reserve card that had begun as a lie and turned into a kind of promise, and a look in his eyes that told her gratitude was not something life had allowed him to feel easily. Claire balanced a tray of appetizers on one hand and moved past table 12, where a venture capitalist was explaining the stock market too loudly, and table 6, where an anniversary couple leaned toward each other like they were sharing oxygen. She kept her expression neutral, but her mind returned to Ethan again and again. Not because he was striking, though he was. Not because he was wealthy, though anyone with eyes could tell he came wrapped in a level of tailoring most people only saw in storefront glass. It was the restraint that stayed with her. Most men she had seen humiliated in public either exploded or collapsed. Ethan had done neither. He had absorbed the insult with such controlled stillness that it had somehow made the whole thing more painful to witness. Claire. She turned at the sound of her manager's voice. Daniel Reeves stood near the service station with his tablet tucked under one arm, his tie too tight and his smile too false. The look of a man who believed customer service meant protecting the paying customer from consequences. A word. Claire set down the tray. I am in the middle of service. You were in the middle of service when you escorted a guest off the floor without checking with me. His voice stayed low, but his irritation had edges. Vanessa Cole is complaining. Claire folded a linen napkin once, precisely. About what? Daniel stared at her, as if the answer were obvious. About being embarrassed. That almost made Claire laugh, but she held it back. Interesting. I thought she was the one doing the embarrassing. Daniel exhaled through his nose. Whether you agreed with her behavior is not the point. It feels very much like the point. The point, he said, stepping closer, is that this restaurant does not take sides in personal disputes between guests. Claire met his gaze. When one person is publicly humiliating another, that stops being personal. Daniel's face tightened. He was the sort of man who liked compassion as long as it did not interfere with table turnover. Just finish your shift, he said, and do not do anything else dramatic tonight. Claire gave a short nod because arguing further would only delay the work. But as she turned away, she understood something she had always known in pieces and now felt whole. Some places looked elegant because they had become experts at hiding what they tolerated. 10 minutes later, she carried a fresh pot of hot water to the courtyard. Ethan was still there, seated where she had left him, one hand resting beside the teacup, the candlelight touching the sharp line of his jaw. He had taken off his coat and folded it over the back of a nearby chair. Without the formal armor of the dining room, he looked less like a man built for magazine profiles and more like someone who had learned how to survive very long winters alone. I was beginning to think you had been promoted to another section, he said as she approached. Claire poured the water carefully into the small ceramic pot. My manager believes I have a tendency toward drama. Do you? Only when necessary. Ethan glanced toward the doorway. Was he upset because you helped me? Claire set the pot down. He was upset because the wrong person complained first. Ethan looked at her for a moment, then lowered his eyes to the reserved card beside his cup. He ran his thumb along its edge like it was more fragile than paper should be. This was not the worst blind date I have ever had, he said. Claire blinked. That is a depressing sentence. A shadow of a smile touched his mouth. I once had a woman ask if my condition was genetic before the appetizers arrived. Claire winced. Please tell me you left. I stayed for the entree. Why? He leaned back slightly. Because sometimes leaving feels too much like agreeing with them. That settled between them in the cold air, honest and heavy. Claire understood it immediately. She had waited tables long enough to know that dignity was often just the decision not to let someone else write the final line of your evening. For what it is worth, she said, you did not look small in there. Ethan lifted his eyes to hers. I felt small. That is different. He said nothing for a second, and in that silence Claire noticed again the fine crack on the face of his watch, a fault line through something expensive and otherwise immaculate. It made him seem more real than polished men were supposed to seem. Can I ask you something? Ethan said. Why did you do it? Claire considered pretending not to understand, but there was no point. Because cruelty gets stronger when people decorate it with silence, she said. And because my mother taught me that if someone is being shamed in public, the first decent person to step in changes the whole temperature of the room. Ethan absorbed that quietly. Your mother sounds formidable. Claire smiled, this time with warmth. She is, even from a hospital bed. The words slipped out before she could decide whether to offer them, and Ethan's expression changed almost imperceptibly. Not pity. Attention. Real attention. Is she all right? He asked. Claire tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Some days are better than others. It was more than she usually told customers, but Ethan no longer felt like a customer. He felt like someone standing at the edge of a truth she had been carrying alone for too long. And when he looked at her again, with that same steady, unguarded gratitude, Claire had the strange feeling that this night was not ending in the courtyard hall. It was only beginning. The courtyard had emptied of sound until all Claire could hear was the distant hum of traffic on Tremont Street and the soft tap of Ethan's fingers against the porcelain cup. For a few seconds neither of them spoke, and the quiet did not feel awkward. It felt earned. Inside, the restaurant still moved at full speed, but out here time had slowed into something gentler, something that made the city feel farther away than a brick wall and a narrow doorway should have allowed. Ethan was the first to break the silence. Hospital bed. He repeated carefully, not prying, only giving her the chance to take the words back if she wanted to. Claire rested one hand on the back of the empty chair across from him and looked toward the string lights above them. My mother has a cardiac condition, she said. She has had it for years, but it got worse last winter. I pick up extra shifts when I can. Marlowe House on Fridays and Saturdays, a brunch spot in Back Bay on Sundays, and catering when somebody calls in desperate. Ethan listened without interrupting, the way very few people did anymore. Claire gave a faint smile with no humor in it. The glamorous Boston life. That sounds less like glamour and more like endurance, he said. Claire let out a small breath that might have been a laugh if it had not carried so much fatigue under it. Endurance pays the pharmacy bills. Ethan lowered his eyes briefly, and when he looked back up there was something different in his expression. Not sympathy. Respect. It was rare enough that Claire felt it immediately. Do you always tell strangers the truth that quickly? He asked. No, she said. Do you? Ethan glanced at the cracked watch on his wrist, then out toward the city beyond the courtyard wall. No, he said. But tonight has not exactly followed the usual script. Claire studied him for a moment, noticing the precision with which he carried himself even when he was tired, the careful economy of movement that suggested discipline rather than fragility. There was a stillness about him that did not read as weakness. It read as someone who had rebuilt himself in private and was tired of people assuming they understood the blueprint just because they noticed the chair. Can I ask you something personal? She said. Ethan tilted his head slightly. You already have. But yes. Claire hesitated, not because she was afraid of offending him, but because she wanted to ask it the right way. The watch, she said. It is cracked. You still wear it. Why? Ethan looked down at it, and for the first time all evening the control in his face loosened enough to reveal memory. It stopped at 4:17, he said quietly. That was the time of the accident. Claire did not react with shock. She simply waited. Ethan's voice stayed calm, but the calm had weight behind it now. I used to think I kept it because I hated wasting expensive things. Then I realized that was not it. I keep it because there was a version of me that ended at 4:17. And for a while I was angry at the world for continuing without asking whether I was ready. Claire felt that sentence settle somewhere deep. She had known loss in slow motion, through invoices and test results and nights spent pretending not to be scared in front of her mother. But there was something brutally honest in the way Ethan described time itself splitting open. What did you do before? She asked. Before the accident? Everything too fast, he said, and there it was again. That dry humor that seemed to arrive only when he forgot to guard it. Too much work. Too much travel. Too many plans scheduled in 15-minute blocks. I was the kind of man who thought efficiency was the same thing as a life well lived. Claire smiled softly. And now? Ethan looked at her, then at the reserved card beside his cup. Now I know a single decent moment can outweigh an entire week. The words landed more gently than a compliment, which was why they mattered more. Claire reached for the teapot and refilled his cup, though it was still half full, more to give her hand something to do than because he needed it. You make it sound like I rescued a prince from a dragon. No, Ethan said. You rescued a man from becoming the joke he was expected to quietly survive. Claire looked down for a moment, and in the reflection on the dark tea, she saw the shape of the evening more clearly than she wanted to. She had stepped in because it was right. That part had been simple. What was less simple was the growing sense that Ethan Whitmore was not a stranger she would forget by Monday. He was becoming a hinge in the night, the point everything before would swing away from. A sharp burst of movement from inside the restaurant drew Claire's attention. Through the glass door she saw Daniel crossing the dining room fast, tablet in hand. His expression strained in a way that usually meant money had entered the situation. He spotted her in the courtyard, then slowed, rearranging his face before stepping outside. Mr. Whitmore, he said, all polished courtesy now, as though he had not spent the last 20 minutes worrying about the wrong guest's complaint. I was not aware you were still with us this evening. Claire felt the shift immediately. Ethan heard it too. Daniel knew the name now, not just from a reservation list, but from recognition. Real recognition. Something important clicked into place behind his eyes, and suddenly his posture looked less managerial than nervous. Ethan turned his chair slightly to face him. That is interesting, he said, his tone smooth enough to make Claire glance at him. Your staff members seemed aware enough to offer me the only dignity this restaurant has shown tonight. Daniel's smile faltered by half an inch. I am sure there has been a misunderstanding. Claire went very still. She had heard that sentence all her life from people who benefited from exactly understanding what had happened. Ethan rested one hand on the wheel of his chair, relaxed but unmistakably in control. No, he said. I believe the misunderstanding happened before I got here. I was under the impression Marlowe House understood the difference between hospitality and cowardice. The courtyard fell silent again, but this silence was different from the one in the dining room. This one did not belong to shame. It belonged to power, shifting quietly into the wronged man's hands while the only witness who mattered stood beside him holding a teapot and trying to understand exactly who Ethan Whitmore really was. Daniel Reeves had the kind of smile that looked expensive from a distance and flimsy up close. It was the smile of a man who had spent years standing near power without ever understanding what real character looked like. Claire watched him straighten his jacket cuffs and shift his weight, as if posture alone could rescue him from what he had just walked into. A few minutes earlier he had been scolding her for embarrassing a rude customer. Now he was standing in the courtyard speaking to Ethan Whitmore with a careful tone that belonged to boardrooms, investors, and people whose names changed how quickly favors were offered. Claire felt the contradiction like a cold draft. Ethan, on the other hand, looked almost untouched by it. He sat with one hand resting on the arm of his chair and the other near the cracked silver watch, his expression composed, his voice low and controlled in a way that made Daniel's polished manner seem even thinner. Mr. Whitmore, Daniel said again, trying for warmth this time. Please accept my sincere apologies if your experience tonight fell below our standards. Ethan glanced toward the glass door leading back into the dining room, where the golden light made everything inside look softer and more forgiving than it really was. Your standards, he said, appear to depend on who is doing the humiliating and who is expected to absorb it. Daniel gave a tight nod, as if agreeing in principle might save him in practice. We value all guests. Claire almost looked away. It was always amazing how quickly institutions found noble language after the damage was done. Ethan did not raise his voice. He did not need to. If that were true, he said, your waitress would not have been the only person in this building who understood the difference between service and dignity. Daniel's eyes flicked to Claire then, and for the first time that evening she saw something like calculation mixed with discomfort. She knew that look. It was the moment someone realized the person they had dismissed might now be standing too close to a consequence. Claire is a valued member of our staff, Daniel said. Ethan's gaze did not move. Interesting. That is not the impression I got when you came out here. The silence that followed was so exact it almost felt measured. Claire stood with the teapot in her hands, suddenly aware of every small sound around them. The distant hiss from the kitchen door opening, the faint clatter of silverware being reset inside, the wind lifting the edge of the paper reserved card on the table. That little card had started as an improvised shield. Now it seemed to sit between them like evidence. Daniel cleared his throat. How would you like us to make this right? It was the wrong question, and Claire knew Ethan knew it too. There was something about asking powerful people how to smooth over a wrong that missed the point entirely. Some injuries were not financial. Some insults could not be comped with dessert or gift certificates or apologies written in the grammar of risk management. Ethan looked up at Daniel with the kind of stillness that forced honesty into the space, whether people wanted it or not. Start by not asking me what I would like purchased, he said. Ask yourself why a woman could mock a disabled man in the middle of your dining room, and the only person with enough courage to intervene was someone making hourly wages. Daniel opened his mouth, closed it, then tried another route. Miss Cole has already left the premises. That was never the central problem, Ethan replied. Claire felt a small, involuntary surge of admiration at that. It would have been easy for Ethan to make this about punishing Vanessa alone. Easy to isolate the cruelty in one careless person and leave the surrounding silence untouched. But he was naming the deeper failure, the one Claire had spent years feeling without always having words for it. Daniel shifted again. I understand your concern. No, Ethan said, and for the first time there was the faintest edge in his voice. Not harsh, just unanswerable. You understand my name. Claire lowered her eyes for a second because the truth of that landed harder than anything else said so far. Daniel had not suddenly grown a conscience. He had grown awareness of who had been wronged. That was different, and Ethan had seen it immediately. Daniel's face lost another degree of confidence. I assure you, if we had known. Ethan stopped him with a glance. Exactly. The single word settled over the courtyard like a verdict. Claire looked at Ethan then, really looked at him, and began to understand that his wealth was not the most commanding thing about him. It was his clarity. He did not let people hide behind polished phrases. He took their excuses apart with fewer words than they used to make them. Daniel seemed to realize this too. He turned toward Claire, perhaps hoping to reposition the conversation on safer ground. Claire, why don't you head back inside? I can handle this. Ethan spoke before she could. No, the word was calm, but it changed the axis of the moment. Daniel went still. Claire did too. Ethan lifted the reserved card between his fingers and examined it briefly, as though its weight had increased since Claire first placed it beside his plate. She stays, he said. She is the reason I did not leave this place believing dignity was entirely out of fashion. Something warm and startling moved through Claire before she could stop it. She had spent years being efficient, dependable, invisible in the way good service workers were often expected to be. Tonight, in the mouth of a man like Ethan Whitmore, her decency had been named as if it mattered. Not flirted with. Not romanticized. Respected. Daniel forced a nod. Of course. And for the record, Ethan continued, whatever assumptions you are making about how this evening should be managed, discard them. I am not interested in spectacle. I am interested in whether this establishment knows how to treat the next vulnerable person who comes through that door when no one important is watching. Daniel swallowed. Understood. Ethan set the reserved card back down carefully beside his tea. Good, he said, because I will be asking that exact question again very soon. Claire caught the faint change in Daniel's expression at those words, the quick flash of alarm from someone sensing that tonight was not ending when the bill was paid. It was becoming a story with consequences. And as Daniel finally excused himself and disappeared back through the glass door, Claire stood in the cold courtyard under the string lights and understood, with a certainty that made her pulse quicken, that Ethan Whitmore was not merely a wealthy stranger who had wandered into her section on a terrible blind date. He was a man used to building outcomes. And for reasons she could not yet name, she had just been written into one. After Daniel disappeared back into the restaurant, the courtyard seemed to exhale. The tension did not vanish, but it changed shape. It was no longer the sharp humiliation of a public insult. It had become something quieter and far more dangerous for the people inside Marlowe House: accountability. Claire set the teapot down and looked at Ethan with a question she had not yet decided whether she had the right to ask. He noticed it immediately. Go ahead, he said. You have that expression people get before they ask me something careful. Claire folded her arms lightly against the cold. You said you would be asking that question again very soon. That did not sound casual. Ethan rested his gaze on the string lights overhead for a moment, then back on her. It was not. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and drew out a slim black card case, opening it with the unhurried precision of someone who disliked theatricality even when the moment invited it. He handed her a card. The paper was heavy, the lettering simple and expensive without trying to prove anything. Whitmore Holdings. Beneath it, in smaller type, Whitmore Mobility Foundation. Claire read the name once, then again, as if repetition might make the distance between the man in front of her and the world printed on the card feel smaller. You are that Ethan Whitmore, she said softly. I assume there are not many of us, he replied. Claire looked up from the card. You own Whitmore Holdings. I built it, he said. There is a difference. The answer was so direct that Claire almost smiled. It fit him. Nothing about Ethan suggested inherited softness or the kind of money that made people vague around facts. He had the air of a man who had been forced to become exact. And the foundation? She asked. Ethan glanced at his watch, the cracked face catching a thread of candlelight. That came later. Claire turned the card over in her fingers. She had heard the name before, of course. Everyone in Boston had. Whitmore Holdings had money in real estate, hospitality, medical tech, and enough civic projects to keep Ethan's face in magazines whether he wanted it there or not. But the foundation was what she remembered more clearly now that she saw it in print. Mobility grants, adaptive housing, rehabilitation research. She had passed a bus stop ad for it in February and never connected that public name to the quiet man drinking Earl Grey in a courtyard because a stranger had decided his wheelchair made him laughable. You were not going to tell me, Claire said. Ethan gave the smallest shake of his head. No, why? He held her gaze. Because I wanted one conversation tonight that was not rearranged by my net worth. The honesty of it went straight through her. Claire had spent enough time around wealthy customers to know how often status distorted a room. People either performed admiration or sharpened resentment. Very few stayed normal. She looked down at the card again, then at the reserved sign, then back at Ethan. Suddenly a dozen small details of the night aligned differently. Daniel's nervous face, the precision in Ethan's clothes, the instinctive authority in his voice. So when Daniel came out here, he had finally placed the name. Ethan said, yes. Claire let out a slow breath. That is why his apology changed. That is why his fear arrived. Ethan corrected gently. Claire leaned one hip against the edge of the table, studying him. And you are planning to come back. I have a meeting here on Monday afternoon. He said it simply, but the sentence landed with the force of a reveal she had not prepared for. Claire blinked. At Marlowe House. Whitmore Hospitality acquired a controlling interest in the parent group 3 weeks ago. For a second, she only stared at him. The courtyard, the candle, the city beyond the wall, all of it seemed to tilt half an inch. You own this restaurant too. Partially, at the moment. Fully enough to ask unpleasant questions on Monday. Claire gave a disbelieving laugh under her breath. It escaped before she could stop it, because the irony was too sharp not to feel almost cinematic. So my manager lectured me for protecting a guest who technically signs his paycheck. Ethan's mouth curved, not smug, just tiredly amused. That seems to be the summary. Claire shook her head once. This night is absurd. Most honest nights are. She should have stepped back then, should have restored the clean line between waitress and guest, between hourly life and corporate power. But the line had already blurred, not because Ethan was rich, but because he had trusted her with the truth instead of using it like a spotlight. I'm not sure whether to apologize for not knowing who you were, she said. Do not. Ethan answered at once. You were the first person all evening who behaved as though it did not matter. That settled warmly in her chest, and Claire hated how much it affected her. She had learned the hard way not to romanticize wealthy men with good manners. Good manners were often just better tailoring for selfishness. But Ethan did not feel polished in that way. He felt disciplined, bruised in private, and unusually alert to the moral temperature of a room. So what happens Monday? She asked. Ethan looked through the glass doors toward the dining room, where polished service continued as though the evening had not already divided itself into consequences. I meet with Daniel Reeves, the regional operations director, and the ownership transition team. I ask how a place that markets elegance failed the most basic test of decency. He paused, then added, and I decide whether this location deserves to keep its current leadership. Claire felt a flutter of alarm at that, immediate and practical. If this is about me, I do not want someone fired just because I broke protocol. Ethan turned fully toward her. Claire, this is not about you breaking protocol. It is about a manager protecting revenue before dignity and only rediscovering his principles when he recognized the name on the reservation. He let that sink in before continuing. There is a difference between mercy and enabling. She lowered her eyes for a second because she knew he was right, and knowing did not make the truth less complicated. Jobs were not abstract to Claire. Jobs were rent, prescriptions, parking fees at the hospital, coffee bought with exact change at 5:30 in the morning before a second shift. Ethan seemed to read part of that in her face. I am not interested in making your life harder, he said, quieter now. In fact, I suspect I may be trying to do the opposite. Claire looked up. What does that mean? Ethan reached for the reserved card and turned it once between his fingers. It means people reveal themselves in moments like tonight, he said. And when I find someone with judgment, courage, and more grace than the room deserves, I tend to remember. His eyes lifted to hers, steady and unreadable in a way that only made the moment feel more serious. Monday is not the end of this story, Claire. It is where the room finally catches up to what you already knew. And standing there beneath the lights with his business card in one hand and the damp Boston air moving softly through the courtyard, Claire understood that the small lie she had spoken to save a stranger from humiliation had opened a door neither of them could close now, because on the other side of it waited not just wealth or consequence, but the dangerous beginning of being seen by someone who had the power to change everything and the restraint not to abuse it. Monday arrived in a clean gray light that made Boston look polished and unforgiving at the same time. By 11:30, Marlowe House had transformed itself into its daytime version of elegance. All quiet silverware, spotless glass, and staff members speaking in softer voices as if refinement could be arranged by volume alone. Claire tied her apron with steadier hands than she felt and tried to focus on the lunch setup, but the business card in her coat pocket had made concentration nearly impossible since she woke up. Ethan Whitmore. Whitmore Holdings. Whitmore Mobility Foundation. The words had followed her through Sunday brunch in Back Bay, through the subway ride home, through the late-night call with the hospital billing office, through every practical task that usually protected her from imagination. By noon, Daniel Reeves had already checked his reflection in the wine room door 3 times and instructed the staff twice to maintain peak professional standards, which told Claire more than any official memo could have. He knew Monday mattered. The only thing he did not know was how much Claire already understood. At 12:15, a black sedan stopped at the curb outside. Claire saw it through the front window while polishing a stack of water glasses, and for one strange second the entire restaurant seemed to sharpen around that sight. Ethan entered with no entourage theatrical enough to announce power, just one assistant in a navy suit carrying a slim leather portfolio, and a woman from corporate operations Claire recognized from a newspaper feature about the ownership transition. Ethan wore a dark charcoal jacket, open at the collar this time instead of formal evening clothes, and the same silver watch with the thin crack across its face. The wheelchair looked less like an object people might pity and more like part of a system he had mastered. He did not pause at the entrance. He did not scan the room to see who was watching. He moved through it as though he had long ago decided that other people's discomfort was not his responsibility to manage. Daniel appeared almost instantly, smile assembled, hand extended. Mr. Whitmore, welcome back. We are honored to have you. Ethan shook his hand once, briefly. That is a stronger performance than Friday. Claire nearly looked down to hide her reaction, but Ethan's gaze had already found her across the room. It lasted no more than a second, just enough for recognition to pass between them without becoming a spectacle. Still, the air around her changed. Not because others noticed, though some did, but because she felt the quiet steadiness of being acknowledged by someone who had not forgotten. Daniel ushered Ethan and the others toward the private dining room near the wine wall. As the door closed behind them, the restaurant resumed motion, but none of it felt normal. Staff members moved with heightened care. Even the line cooks in the open kitchen seemed aware that money and judgment were sitting behind frosted glass 15 feet away. Claire carried trays, refilled coffee, reset tables, and tried not to think about what was being said in that room. She failed. At 1:05, Daniel emerged alone to ask for still water, espresso, and the revised quarterly service reports. At 1:20, the regional operations woman stepped out with a face so blank it had to be deliberate. At 1:35, the door opened again, and Ethan came into the dining room by himself. Claire was at the service station rolling silverware when she felt him before she saw him, not physically, but the way certain presences altered the pressure of a room. She turned, and there he was, a few feet away, composed as ever. "Claire," he said. Her name and his voice still had that unsettling quality of sincerity, as if he used words only when he meant them. "Mr. Whitmore." "Ethan," he said, then glanced toward the private room. "If that does not place your employment at risk." Despite herself, she smiled. "I think that line moved sometime Friday night." Ethan's expression softened by a degree. "I wanted to speak to you before the afternoon gets crowded." Claire set the bundle of silverware down. "Is everything all right?" "That depends on your definition." He held up the reserve card. Her reserve card. The edges were slightly softened now from being handled, but the gold script still caught the light the same way it had in the courtyard. Claire stared at it. "You kept it." "I told you," Ethan said. "I remember people who reveal themselves in important moments." He turned the card once between his fingers. "I asked several questions in that room today. Most of the answers were expensive versions of fear. Yours remains the only honest act associated with this location." "All weekend." Claire glanced toward the closed private dining room door. "That sounds ominous." "It is corrective," he said. "Daniel Reeves will not be managing this restaurant after today." The words landed hard, even though part of her had expected them. Claire drew in a breath. "Because of Friday." "Because Friday exposed what was already there," Ethan replied. "A person does not fail a moral test by accident. They fail it because they have practiced the wrong priorities for years." Claire looked down for a moment. She believed him. That was the trouble. She believed him and still felt the tug of practical sympathy that working people learn too early. Lives were complicated. Paychecks fed children, paid rent, bought insulin, covered car repairs, kept fragile families 1 month ahead of disaster. Ethan seemed to read the conflict in her face. "You do not have to be comfortable with the outcome to know it was earned," he said quietly. Claire lifted her eyes to his. "I know." The honesty between them had become strangely easy, and that frightened her a little. Ethan rested the reserved card on the service counter between them. "There is something else," he said. "After reviewing staff reports, guest responses, and your record, I asked the operations team a question." Claire waited. "What happens to a business?" Ethan continued. "When the people with the best instincts are kept in the lowest paid positions while leadership is handed to those who mistake control for character?" Claire gave a small, uncertain laugh. "That sounds less like a question and more like an indictment." Sometimes those are the same thing. The lunchroom behind them shimmered with ordinary life, but the moment felt set apart from it, as if the world had narrowed to the polished wood counter, the little ivory card, and the measured force of Ethan's attention. "What are you saying?" Claire asked. Ethan's gaze held hers steadily. "I am saying this restaurant, and several others in the group, need a new training initiative. One centered on dignity, accessibility, and service standards that treat vulnerable guests as human beings before revenue sources. I am saying my team believes someone with lived judgment should help build it." Claire's pulse quickened before she could stop it. "You cannot mean me. I rarely say things I do not mean." She stared at him, searching for irony and finding none. "I am a waitress working double shifts to cover my mother's medication. I do not have a corporate title, a business degree, or whatever polished language people in those rooms use when they want to sound qualified." Ethan did not blink. "You have discernment, courage, and the ability to act decently without an audience. Those qualities are rarer and more expensive to teach than any degree." For a second, Claire forgot to breathe. It was not the offer itself that moved her first. It was the fact that he had seen her competence without dressing it up as charity. He was not offering rescue in the humiliating sense. He was offering recognition. And in a life built on holding things together with overtime and restraint, recognition had begun to feel almost as dangerous as hope. Claire did not answer right away because some offers were too large to process in the same breath that delivered them. Around them, lunch service continued with its usual rhythm, forks against china, low conversation, the soft movement of polished shoes across dark wood floors, but none of it felt close anymore. The restaurant had narrowed to the service counter between them, to the small reserved card resting there like proof that one ordinary act could become the hinge of an entire future, and to Ethan Whitmore looking at her with a steadiness that left no room for false modesty or easy escape. "I do not know the first thing about building a training initiative," Claire said at last. Ethan leaned one arm lightly against his chair. "That is not true. You know what should have happened on Friday. You know what did happen. And you know the difference without needing a committee to translate it into polished language." Claire let out a quiet breath. Knowing what is right and knowing how to run a corporate program are not the same thing. "No," Ethan said. "But one matters more than the other in the beginning." Before Claire could answer, the private dining room door opened behind him. The regional operations executive stepped out first, followed by Daniel Reeves carrying a folder with the brittle posture of a man trying to remain vertical inside a personal earthquake. He did not look at Claire. He barely looked at Ethan. He moved past them toward the host stand with a face emptied of expression, and in that absence Claire saw the finality of Monday far more clearly than she had from Ethan's words alone. She should have felt triumphant. Instead, she felt sober. Justice was necessary. It was also rarely elegant up close. The operations executive paused near Ethan. "The press team needs you in Back Bay by 4, she said. "And legal has approved the statement for the hospitality rollout gala." Ethan nodded once. "Thank you, Laura." Gala. Claire heard the word and felt it land somewhere between curiosity and alarm. Laura turned to her with a professional smile that carried none of Daniel's old condescension. "You must be Claire Bennett." Claire straightened instinctively. "Yes. I have heard more about your judgment this morning than I have heard about this location's quarterly performance. That is unusual in the best possible way." Claire did not know what to do with that, so she simply said, "Thank you." Laura glanced at Ethan, then back to Claire. "If Mr. Whitmore invited you to the rollout gala this evening, I would strongly recommend saying yes." Claire blinked. "This evening," Ethan answered before Laura could. "It is a foundation and hospitality event at the Langham Ballroom. We are announcing the expansion of Whitmore Mobility and a new guest dignity standard across every property under the group." Claire stared at him. "You were going to invite me tonight. I am inviting you now." The matter-of-fact tone should not have made her pulse jump, but it did. "Ethan, I do not have a gown for a ballroom. I have a second shift at the brunch place tomorrow. My mother has a cardiology appointment at 8:30, and I do not even know what part of this day is real anymore." Laura, to Claire's relief, did not pity her. She only said, "All real transitions feel inconvenient at first." Then she excused herself with the efficiency of someone whose entire career probably depended on moving powerful people through crowded schedules. Claire watched her go, then turned back to Ethan. "A gala," she repeated, as though saying it again might make it sound less impossible. Ethan picked up the reserved card and turned it once between his fingers. "You do not have to come." Claire looked at him. "That sounds like you know I will say no." "No," he said quietly. "It sounds like I know the difference between an invitation and a debt." That struck her harder than the invitation itself. In the span of a weekend, Ethan had managed to do what very few powerful men ever did around women with less money and less institutional protection. He had offered opportunity without wrapping it in obligation. Claire folded a clean napkin, unfolded it, then folded it again. "What would I even do there?" Ethan set the card down. "Stand in a room that is overdue to hear the truth from someone who lives on the receiving end of other people's assumptions. Meet the team if you want to consider the initiative. Leave after 20 minutes if you do not." Claire almost smiled. "You make ballrooms sound manageable." "I dislike most of them," Ethan said. "That helps." She was about to answer when the front door opened and a gust of cold air slipped into the dining room with two women in expensive coats. Claire recognized one of them immediately. Vanessa Cole. Her hair was perfect, her lipstick precise, her expression arranged into the kind of confidence that assumed the room would adapt itself to her comfort. She did not see Ethan at first. She marched straight to the host's stand, phone already in hand, talking too brightly about a forgotten bracelet she was sure she had left Friday night. Then her eyes traveled across the room and found him. The change in her face was subtle but unmistakable. Surprise first. Calculation second. Claire felt the whole restaurant register the shift, Because people who trafficked in appearances always brought a certain electrical tension with them. Vanessa recovered quickly and walked over with a smile polished for social survival. "Ethan," she said, as if their last interaction had ended in mild inconvenience rather than public cruelty. "I had no idea you were here." Claire went very still. Ethan did not. "That makes one of us," he said. Vanessa's smile tightened only slightly. "I think there was a misunderstanding the other night." Claire felt the words before she processed them. Of course. Another misunderstanding. Another pretty ribbon tied around an ugly thing. Vanessa finally acknowledged Claire with a brief glance. The kind women like her had perfected over years of ranking other women by usefulness. "And you must be the waitress." Before Claire could speak, Ethan did. "Her name is Claire." 3 simple words. No volume, no drama. But the correction landed with the precision of a boundary she had not expected anyone to draw on her behalf. Vanessa gave a little laugh. "Right, Claire. I am sure this all feels very exciting." Claire looked at her then, really looked at her, and saw what she had not fully seen Friday night, because humiliation had made everything blur at the edges. Vanessa was not merely rude. She was deeply convinced that status made cruelty reasonable and kindness suspicious. "Exciting is not the word I would use," Claire said evenly. "Instructive, maybe." Vanessa's expression cooled. "I only came for my bracelet." "You should speak to the host," Ethan said. "And while you are here, you may want to know that this restaurant now has a documented guest conduct policy." It was overdue. The color in Vanessa's face shifted by a degree. "You cannot seriously be rewriting policy over one awkward date." Ethan's eyes did not leave hers. "No," he said. "I am rewriting policy because too many people confuse wealth with worth and assume decency is optional when the target looks vulnerable." Silence moved outward from their table like a dropped stone through water. Claire could feel staff members pretending not to watch. Vanessa opened her mouth, then closed it, perhaps realizing too late that rooms changed when the audience stopped admiring the wrong performer. Claire should have enjoyed that moment more than she did. Instead, she felt something steadier and more important rise inside her, certainty. Friday night, she had rescued a stranger with one improvised sentence. Monday afternoon, that stranger was standing in full view of the world, making it clear that her courage had not been small, accidental, or invisible. And when Ethan turned back to her a moment later, his voice quiet again, and asked, "Claire, will you come tonight?" She understood that the question was no longer just about a gala. It was about whether she was ready to step into a room that had always been closed to people like her and speak in her own name. Claire had spent most of her life saying no to anything that looked too beautiful to be safe. No to promises that arrived too quickly. No to opportunities wrapped in charm. No to men with polished shoes and careful voices who mistook access for sincerity. But when Ethan asked her that question in the center of Marlowe House, with the last of Monday lunch service moving around them and Vanessa Cole standing a few feet away in the chill of her own irrelevance, Claire understood that this was not one of those moments. This was not a glittering invitation designed to make her feel small later. It was not pity wearing expensive tailoring. It was a door opening because she had done one decent thing when the room had failed to do it. Claire met Ethan's eyes and felt the answer settle into place before she spoke it. "Yes," she said. Ethan did not smile broadly or turn the moment into a performance. He only gave a small nod, but relief moved across his face so quietly it almost hurt to see. "Good," he said. "I will have a car pick you up at 6:30. And Claire?" "Yes." He held up the reserved card once more, the gold script flashing in the afternoon light. "Do not come as staff." Vanessa let out a tiny breath of disbelief, the kind people make when the story refuses to keep them at the center. Claire barely noticed. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of polished glasses, quiet rumors, and one text message from an unknown number that simply gave a time, a driver's name, and the words "no pressure. Come only if you want to." Claire read that last line 3 times before slipping the phone back into her apron pocket. At 5:40 she clocked out, rode the green line home, and stood in the narrow hallway of her apartment staring at her closet as if the right answer might reveal itself between work uniforms and winter coats. There was only one dress that could pass in a ballroom, a midnight blue one she had bought for a cousin's wedding 3 years ago and worn exactly once. It was simple, elegant, and a little tighter at the waist than she remembered, But when she looked in the mirror, she did not see someone pretending to belong. She saw someone tired of asking permission. Before leaving, she stopped by her mother's room. Linda Bennett looked up from her blanket and studied her daughter with the sharp eyes illness had not dimmed. "That is not a brunch shift dress," she said. Claire laughed softly. "No, is this about the man from the restaurant?" Claire hesitated, then nodded. Linda smiled in the slow, knowing way mothers sometimes did when life finally admitted what they had sensed before anyone else. "Then go," she said, "and do not spend the evening apologizing for taking up space." At 6:32, the car pulled up outside the building. By 7:15, Claire was standing beneath the high chandeliers of the Langham Ballroom, where glass, gold, and candlelight turned the room into something almost unreal. Men in dark suits and women in silk moved through the space with practiced ease, but Claire no longer felt the old instinct to shrink. She felt alert, yes, and out of place in the technical sense, but not in the moral one. Then she saw Ethan across the room, speaking with donors near a stage lit in warm amber. He wore a black tuxedo with no unnecessary flourish, and the cracked silver watch remained at his wrist as if wealth had never been enough to make him erase what pain had taught him. When he noticed her, the conversation around him seemed to dissolve. He crossed the ballroom toward her, not rushed, not theatrical, simply certain. "You came," he said. Claire lifted one shoulder slightly. "I said I would." Ethan's gaze moved over her for one honest second, and the admiration in it was so unguarded that Claire had to steady herself against the absurd urge to look away. "You look exactly like someone who belongs in this room," he said. Claire smiled. "That sounds suspiciously rehearsed." "It would be if it were not true." A few minutes later, Ethan guided her toward a quiet display near the stage. Inside a glass case rested two objects on dark velvet. The first was his cracked silver watch. The second was the ivory reserve card Claire had placed on his table Friday night. Beneath them, engraved in brass, were the words "The moment dignity returned." Claire stared at the display, then at him. "Ethan." Her voice came out softer than she intended. "You put this in a ballroom." "No," he said. "I put it in the story where it belongs." Before she could answer, the lights dimmed slightly and the program began. Ethan was introduced first, and the room applauded with the easy enthusiasm people reserved for powerful men who funded important things. He accepted it with grace and then did something Claire could tell the room had not expected. He spoke briefly about accessibility, about hospitality, about the dangerous laziness of judging human worth by appearance, speed, or ease. Then he turned toward the front row, toward Claire, and said, "3 nights ago, in one of our properties, I was reminded that culture is not built by slogans. It is built by the person in the room who chooses courage when everyone else chooses comfort." "Claire Bennett, would you join me?" The ballroom turned. Hundreds of eyes moved to her at once, and for a split second the old instinct returned, the one that said keep your head down, stay useful, do not risk being seen. Then she remembered her mother's voice. "Do not spend the evening apologizing for taking up space." Claire rose and walked to the stage. Ethan did not take over the moment when she arrived. He simply made room. That, more than the applause, more than the chandeliers, more than the impossible fact of being there at all, was what told her she could trust what stood between them. Claire faced the room and told the truth. She said that dignity was not a luxury service. She said that the test of any place was how it treated the person who could not increase its profit, status, or image. She said that vulnerability was not an invitation for contempt. And when she finished, the applause that rose was different from the one Ethan had received. His had been for power. Hers was for recognition. Later, when the ballroom had softened into dinner and music and the pressure of public attention had finally eased, Ethan found Claire near the display case again. The reserved card gleamed softly beneath the glass. "Laura has your draft offer," he said. "Director of Guest Dignity Initiatives, if you want it. Flexible schedule. Hospital accommodation. Real pay." Claire looked at him, astonishment and laughter meeting somewhere in the middle. "That is a real title." "It was an idea at noon," Ethan said. "It became real around 4. Claire shook her head, smiling now in a way that felt new on her own face. "You build outcomes very quickly." Ethan grew quiet for a moment. "Only when they matter." The music from the ballroom drifted toward them, warm and low. Around them, The city's wealth and ceremony continued in polished circles. But inside the small space by the glass case, none of that was the center anymore. Ethan glanced at the reserve card, then back at Claire. "Friday night," he said. "You told an entire room I had a place prepared for me. That was the first kind thing anyone had done for me in a long time without asking for something in return." Claire's throat tightened unexpectedly. Ethan's voice lowered. "This time, I am not reserving a table." He held her gaze, steady and sincere in a way that made every polished lie she had ever heard seem very far away. "I am asking whether you would let me earn a place in your life." Claire smiled then, not because the moment was perfect, but because it was honest, and honesty had always mattered more. She reached for his hand, and when her fingers closed around his, she felt the quiet strength in him, the one built not from money or status, but from surviving the unkindness of the world without becoming unkind in return. "Yes," she said, and this time the word meant much more than a gala. Outside, Boston glittered through the tall ballroom windows, cold and bright, and still turning. But inside, beside a cracked watch and a little reserve card that had once been a lie and was now proof that a single brave gesture could change the architecture of two lives, Claire Bennett and Ethan Whitmore stood side by side and began the first true chapter of a story neither of them would ever mistake for luck again.